The sound of my son Chris laughing echoed through the funeral home's parking lot as I sat hidden in the back seat of a taxi, listening to him tell his wife Carla how relieved he was that the old bat was finally gone for good. What he didn't know was that the woman he thought he'd cremated 3 days ago was very much alive, and I was about to walk into his inheritance celebration party to remind him that reports of my death had been greatly exaggerated. My name is Helen Caldwell, and until last week, I was supposedly a dead woman.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
My son Chris had held a beautiful memorial service, collected my life insurance policy, and was now throwing a party to celebrate inheriting my estate worth over $2 million. The only problem with his plan was that I was sitting 50 feet away from him, very much breathing, and absolutely furious about what I'd discovered he'd done while I was unconscious in a hospital bed. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because the betrayal I uncovered goes deeper than you could possibly imagine, and the revenge I'm about to serve is going to be sweeter than any justice you've ever witnessed. 3 weeks ago, I was Helen Caldwell, a 73-year-old widow, living comfortably in my paid-off home in Portland, Oregon. I had raised 3 children as a single mother after my husband Arthur died in a construction accident when I was just 45. For nearly 30 years, I had worked double shifts as a nurse while putting my kids through school, saving every penny I could, and building a modest but secure retirement fund through careful investments and a small real estate portfolio I'd accumulated over the decades. My relationship with my children had always been complicated, but I thought it was normal family dysfunction. My oldest son Chris had always been the charmer, smooth-talking his way through life and expecting others to clean up his messes. My daughter Eloise lived across the country and called maybe twice a year, usually when she needed money for her latest crisis. My youngest Liam was the most responsible of the 3, but had grown distant after I refused to co-sign on a business loan for his restaurant venture that I knew would fail. Chris, at 48, had never held a steady job for more than 2 years. He was always chasing get-rich-quick schemes, convinced that his next big idea would make him wealthy without having to do the hard work that real success requires. He'd married Carla 15 years ago, and she'd seemed sweet enough at first, but I'd noticed over the years how she'd whisper calculations in his ear whenever they visited. Her eyes always scanning my house, like she was taking inventory. I should have seen the warning signs, but you never expect your own child to wish you dead. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I had been feeling dizzy and weak for several days, which I attributed to a stomach bug that had been going around the senior center where I volunteered. That morning I collapsed in my kitchen while making coffee, hitting my head hard on the granite countertop as I fell. What I didn't know at the time was that I had suffered a rare condition called a basilar artery stroke, which can cause prolonged unconsciousness that mimics a coma or even death. The symptoms can be so subtle that even medical professionals sometimes miss the signs of life. When my neighbor Mrs. Haven found me 6 hours later and called 911, the paramedics could barely detect a pulse. I was rushed to Portland General Hospital, where I was admitted to the intensive care unit in what appeared to be a deep coma. The doctors told my family that my brain activity was minimal, my vital signs were barely detectable, and that I would likely never regain consciousness. They said I could remain in this vegetative state for months or even years, requiring round-the-clock care that would eventually drain my entire estate. That's when Chris made his decision. While I lay unconscious in that hospital bed, fighting for my life in ways the monitors couldn't detect, Chris was meeting with lawyers and insurance agents, calculating how much money he stood to inherit if I died versus how much it would cost to keep me alive. He consulted with doctors about withdrawing life support, researched the legal requirements for declaring someone deceased, and began the paperwork to have himself named as the executor of my estate. But Chris wasn't patient enough to wait for nature to take its course. After 2 weeks of watching my condition remain stable, rather than deteriorating as he'd hoped, he made a decision that still makes my blood run cold when I think about it. He authorized the hospital to declare me brain dead. Now you have to understand that this wasn't a simple matter of signing a form. Chris had to convince 3 different doctors that continuing my care was futile, that I had no chance of recovery, and that the most merciful thing would be to remove life support and allow me to die with dignity. He presented himself as the loving son who was making the most difficult decision of his life, sacrificing his own hopes for his mother's impossible recovery in order to honor what she would have wanted. The doctors, faced with a seemingly devoted family member and limited ICU resources, agreed to his request. They scheduled the withdrawal of life support for the following Monday, after which my body would be released for cremation according to the wishes Chris claimed I had expressed. What none of them knew was that deep inside my unresponsive body, I was slowly beginning to recover. The basilar artery stroke that had caused my condition was gradually resolving itself, and my brain function was returning bit by bit. I couldn't move or speak or open my eyes, but I could hear everything that was happening around me. And what I heard in those final days before my scheduled death was my son Chris planning my funeral, like he was organizing a celebration. I heard him on the phone with the crematorium, choosing the cheapest possible service, because she won't know the difference. I heard him calling my insurance company to inquire about how quickly they could process the death benefit claim. I heard him and Carla discussing which of my possessions they wanted to keep and which ones they would sell. But most devastating of all, I heard him talking to my other children, Eloise and Liam, convincing them that I was already gone, and that the most loving thing they could do was let me go peacefully rather than prolonging my suffering with expensive medical interventions. He was so convincing, so grief-stricken in his performance, that both of my other children agreed to support his decision without ever coming to see me themselves. Before I tell you how I escaped my own cremation, you need to understand who I was before my son decided I was worth more dead than alive. Because the woman Chris thought he could erase from existence had spent 73 years building something he'd never bothered to understand or respect. I was born Helen Marie Salvatore in 1950, the daughter of Italian immigrants who came to America with nothing but determination and a belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. My father Giuseppe worked in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, while my mother Rosa took in laundry and sewing to make ends meet. They taught me that family meant sacrifice, that you protected the people you loved even when it cost you everything, and that a person's word was their most valuable possession. When I married Arthur Caldwell at 22, I thought I had found my forever partner. Arthur was a gentle giant, 6 feet 4 inches of pure kindness, who worked construction during the day and helped me study for my nursing degree at night. We moved to Portland in 1975, when he got a job with a company building the new transit system, and for 18 years, we built what I thought was an unshakable life together. Arthur and I had our 3 children in quick succession. Chris arrived in 1975, a beautiful baby with bright blue eyes and a smile that could charm anyone. Even as a toddler, he had this magnetic personality that drew people to him. Strangers would stop us on the street to comment on what a handsome, charismatic little boy he was. I was so proud of him, so sure that his natural charm would take him far in life. Eloise came 2 years later, a quiet, thoughtful child who preferred books to people. She was brilliant, scoring in the gifted range on every test, but she always seemed to exist in her own world. While Chris commanded attention wherever he went, Eloise observed from the sidelines, taking everything in but rarely participating in the drama of family life. Liam, Our baby arrived in 1980.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He was the responsible one from the start, the child who cleaned up his toys without being asked and worried when his siblings got into trouble. Even as a little boy, he had this serious expression that made him look like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. For 13 years we were happy. Arthur came home every evening covered in concrete dust and sweat, but always with a smile for his family. We had Sunday dinners where the kids would fight over who got to sit next to their father, and vacation trips to the Oregon coast where we'd build sandcastles and collect shells until long after sunset. Arthur was the one who encouraged me to pursue my nursing career, even when it meant he had to take over bedtime routines and help with homework while I attended evening classes. He never once complained about the extra work or the financial strain of my tuition. He just believed in me in a way that made me believe in myself. But in 1993, everything changed in an instant. Arthur was working on a high-rise construction project downtown when a crane operator made a fatal mistake. A steel beam broke loose and fell 40 feet, crushing my husband and 2 other workers instantly. At 43 years old, I became a widow with 3 children to raise and a mountain of debt that Arthur's life insurance barely covered. The months after Arthur's death were the darkest of my life. Chris, who was 18 then, responded to his father's death by becoming even more reckless and irresponsible. He started drinking, skipping school, and running with a crowd of kids who seemed determined to throw their lives away. Instead of stepping up to help his grieving mother, he added to my stress with every poor decision he made. Eloise, at 16, retreated even further into herself. She spent hours locked in her room, emerging only for meals where she would sit in silence, picking at her food while the rest of us tried to maintain some semblance of normal family conversation. Her grades remained perfect, but I could see her slipping away from us emotionally, building walls that I didn't know how to break down. 13-year-old Liam tried to become the man of the house overnight. He got a paper route to help with expenses, took over many of Arthur's household responsibilities, and appointed himself as his siblings' keeper. It broke my heart to watch him sacrifice his childhood, because he thought our family would fall apart without someone holding it together. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts at the hospital and working weekends to keep us afloat financially. The insurance money from Arthur's accident had covered the funeral expenses and paid off our mortgage, but there was nothing left for college funds or family vacations or any of the things we'd planned when Arthur was alive. For the next 5 years, I worked 60-hour weeks while my children grew up largely raising themselves. I missed school plays and basketball games and parent-teacher conferences because I was always at the hospital, always trying to earn enough money to give them the opportunities their father had wanted them to have. When Chris graduated high school, barely, I had saved enough to pay for his first year of community college. He lasted 1 semester before dropping out to pursue a career as a musician. When that didn't work out, he tried selling cars, then insurance, then real estate. Each career change came with a sob story about unfair bosses, or bad timing, or market conditions beyond his control. And each time, I bailed him out financially while he got back on his feet. Eloise earned a full scholarship to Stanford, where she studied computer science and seemed to thrive academically. But she rarely came home for holidays, and when she did visit, she treated our house like a hotel where she was an unwelcome guest. After graduation, she took a job in Silicon Valley, and gradually reduced contact with the family to birthday cards and occasional phone calls that felt more like obligation than affection. Liam was my pride and joy through high school and college. He worked part-time jobs to help pay for his expenses, maintained excellent grades, and seemed to genuinely understand the sacrifices I was making for our family. When he graduated from Oregon State with a degree in business management, I thought at least one of my children had learned the values Arthur and I had tried to instill. But even Liam's respect had limits, and I learned that lesson the hard way, when he asked me to co-sign a loan for his restaurant dream. By then I was 68, and finally enjoying a comfortable retirement after decades of exhausting work. I had paid off every debt, accumulated a decent investment portfolio, and purchased 2 small rental properties that provided steady income. For the first time since Arthur's death, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. Liam's business plan was ambitious but unrealistic. He wanted to open an upscale farm-to-table restaurant in one of Portland's most expensive neighborhoods, despite having no experience in the food service industry beyond a few part-time jobs during college. The loan he needed was for $300,000, and the bank required a co-signer with substantial assets. I spent weeks reviewing his financial projections, and everything I saw told me this venture would fail within 2 years. The overhead costs were astronomical, the competition was fierce, and Liam had no contingency plan for the inevitable slow periods that kill most new restaurants. When I gently suggested he might want to start smaller or get some industry experience first, he accused me of not believing in him. "You co-signed Chris's car loans when he had no job," he said, his voice bitter with resentment. "You paid for Eloise's graduate school applications when she already had a full ride. But when I ask for help with something I'm actually passionate about, suddenly you're worried about the risk." I tried to explain that those situations had been different, smaller amounts for shorter periods, but Liam wouldn't listen. He saw my refusal as favoritism, as proof that I'd never really believed he was capable of success. The conversation ended with him storming out of my house, and we didn't speak for 6 months. When he finally called, it was to tell me his restaurant had opened with investors he'd found on his own. He was polite but distant, treating me like an acquaintance rather than the mother who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. The restaurant, predictably, closed 18 months later, leaving Liam bankrupt and bitter. But instead of acknowledging that my concerns had been valid, he seemed to blame me for not supporting him when he needed it most. By 2020, my relationship with all 3 of my children had deteriorated into polite but strained interactions. Chris still called when he needed money, but his requests had become demands, delivered with increasing resentment when I occasionally said no. Eloise sent dutiful birthday cards and made perfunctory phone calls 3 or 4 times a year, but she never visited and rarely shared anything meaningful about her life. Liam had moved to Seattle after his restaurant failed and maintained minimal contact, texting occasionally but never calling. I told myself this was normal, that adult children naturally became independent and started their own families. But deep down, I knew something fundamental had broken in our relationships, and I didn't know how to fix it. I had raised them to be self-sufficient, but somehow they had become entitled. I had worked to provide for them, but they seemed to resent the sacrifices I'd made rather than appreciate them. The isolation became more pronounced during the pandemic. For months I barely left my house except for grocery shopping and medical appointments. My volunteer work at the senior center stopped, my book club meetings moved online, and the casual social interactions that had filled my days disappeared entirely. I spent long hours alone, wondering if the distance I felt from my children was my fault, if I had somehow failed them as a mother. It was during this lonely period that I started having the health issues that would eventually lead to my supposed death. The dizziness began in January, just occasional moments when I'd feel unsteady getting up from a chair or turning my head too quickly. I attributed it to age, to the medications I was taking for high blood pressure, to anything except a serious medical condition. The fatigue followed in February. I would wake up exhausted even after a full night's sleep, and simple tasks like doing laundry or preparing meals left me feeling drained. My doctor, Dr. Sheldon Haven, ran some basic tests but found nothing obviously wrong. He suggested I might be dealing with depression related to the isolation of the pandemic, and recommended I consider counseling or antidepressant medication. I rejected both suggestions. I wasn't depressed, I insisted. I was just tired, just getting older, just dealing with the normal aches and pains that came with being in my 70s. I had survived my husband's death, raised 3 children alone, and worked for 40 years in one of the most demanding professions imaginable. I wasn't about to start taking pills because I felt a little run down. The memory problems started in March, subtle at first, but gradually becoming more noticeable. I would walk into a room and forget why I had gone there. I would start sentences and lose track of what I was trying to say. I would put things down and then spend hours looking for them, only to find them in completely illogical places like the refrigerator or my bedroom closet. Chris noticed the changes during one of his increasingly rare visits. He had come by to ask for money to cover his rent, a monthly ritual that had become as predictable as the weather. But instead of his usual smooth pitch about temporary cash flow problems, he spent the entire visit asking probing questions about my health, my daily routines, my ability to manage my finances. "Mom, you seem a little confused," he said with what sounded like genuine concern. "Maybe you should have someone helping you with things like paying bills and managing your investments. It would be terrible if you made a mistake that cost you money." At the time I thought he was being protective, maybe even caring in his own way. I assured him that I was fine, that the occasional forgetfulness was normal for someone my age, and that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. But looking back now, I realize that conversation was the beginning of his plan. He wasn't worried about my well-being. He was assessing my vulnerability. The morning I collapsed in my kitchen wasn't the sudden dramatic event you might imagine. I had woken up feeling dizzy and nauseated, symptoms I'd been experiencing on and off for weeks. I made it to the kitchen to start my usual morning routine of coffee and toast, but as I reached for the coffee canister on the top shelf, the world began to spin violently around me. I remember grabbing for the counter to steady myself, but my legs gave out completely. The last thing I recall was the sharp pain as my head struck the granite edge, and then everything went black. What happened next, I would only learn weeks later from medical records and the fragmented accounts of people who were supposed to care about me. Mrs. Edna Haven, my neighbor of 15 years, found me around 2 in the afternoon. She had noticed that my newspapers were still on the front porch and my curtains were drawn, which was unusual for me. When I didn't answer her knocking, she used the spare key I'd given her years earlier for emergencies. She found me unconscious on the kitchen floor, lying in a pool of blood from the head wound, barely breathing. The paramedics who responded couldn't find a strong pulse initially. My blood pressure was dangerously low, my breathing was shallow and irregular, and I was completely unresponsive to their attempts to wake me. They suspected I had suffered a massive stroke or heart attack, and during the ambulance ride to Portland General Hospital, they had to resuscitate me twice when my heart briefly stopped beating. In the emergency room, the doctors ran every test imaginable: CT scans, MRIs, blood work, neurological assessments. What they found was confusing and contradictory. There was evidence of a stroke in my brainstem, but not the kind of massive, obviously fatal event they had expected based on my symptoms. My brain showed some swelling and restricted blood flow, but there were also signs of healing and recovery that the medical team couldn't quite explain. Arthur Nelson, the neurologist assigned to my case, later told me that basilar artery strokes are among the most misunderstood and misdiagnosed conditions in medicine. They can cause symptoms that mimic death so closely that even experienced doctors sometimes miss the subtle signs of brain activity. Patients can appear completely comatose while actually being aware of their surroundings, trapped in bodies that won't respond to their commands. But I knew none of this while it was happening. From my perspective, I simply fell asleep in my kitchen and woke up in hell. The first sound I became aware of was the steady beeping of medical equipment. Then came the voices, muffled and distant at first, but gradually becoming clearer as whatever fog had surrounded my consciousness began to lift. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like they were made of lead. I tried to move my hands, but they wouldn't obey the commands my brain was sending. The first voice I recognized was Chris's, but he wasn't talking to me. He was standing somewhere near the foot of my bed, speaking in hushed tones to someone I couldn't see. What I heard made my blood run cold, even though I couldn't physically react to show my horror. "The doctor says she's essentially brain dead," Chris was saying, his voice carrying none of the grief you'd expect to hear from a devoted son. "Her body is just going through the motions, but there's no real consciousness there. She could stay like this for months, maybe years, just wasting away while her medical bills eat up everything she worked for." A woman's voice responded, and I realized it was Carla, though she sounded different than I remembered. Harder, more calculating. "What are the doctors recommending?" "They're leaving it up to the family," Chris replied. "They say we could keep her on life support indefinitely, but there's no chance of recovery. It would just be prolonging her suffering and bankrupting her estate to pay for care she'll never benefit from." I wanted to scream, to tell them I could hear every word, that I was still in here fighting to get back to them. But my body was a prison I couldn't escape from, and all I could do was listen in growing horror as they discussed my fate like I was already gone. "Have you talked to Eloise and Liam?" Carla asked. "I called them both yesterday," Chris said. "Eloise can't get time off work to fly out here, but she agrees that Mom wouldn't want to be kept alive artificially if there's no hope." Liam was harder to convince, but I explained the medical situation, and he finally agreed that the kindest thing would be to let her go peacefully. Neither of my other children had come to see me. They were making decisions about my life based entirely on Chris's interpretation of my condition, without ever laying eyes on me or speaking to my doctors directly. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical pain I was experiencing. Over the next few days, I began to understand the full scope of what Chris was planning. He had moved quickly to establish himself as my medical power of attorney, claiming that as my oldest child and the only one living locally, he was the natural choice to make decisions on my behalf. He had consulted with lawyers about probate procedures, contacted my insurance companies to understand the claims process, and even begun preliminary conversations with funeral homes about arrangements. But the most devastating discovery came when I overheard him talking to Dr. Nelson about the timeline for withdrawing life support. Chris wasn't pushing for an immediate decision, he was asking how long the hospital could reasonably maintain my current condition before questions would be raised about the cost and resource allocation. "I want to make sure we're giving her every possible chance," Chris told the doctor, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "But I also don't want to be selfish and keep her suffering just because I can't bear to let her go. What would you say is a reasonable amount of time to wait before we make the difficult decision?" Dr. Nelson, clearly moved by what he perceived as a loving son's anguish, suggested that 2 weeks would be sufficient to see if there was any sign of improvement. If my condition remained unchanged after that period, he said, the family could feel confident that they were making the right choice in allowing me to die with dignity. 2 weeks. Chris had convinced a doctor to give him a 2-week timeline before he could legally murder me, and he was already counting down the days like a child waiting for Christmas morning. What I discovered next shattered any remaining illusions I had about my son's character. On the fourth day of my supposed coma, Chris brought paperwork to my bedside. Not medical forms or insurance documents, but financial papers that he spread across the rolling table where my untouched lunch tray sat cooling. I couldn't see the documents clearly, but I could hear him talking through them with someone on the phone. It was my financial advisor, Helen Caldwell, who had been managing my investment portfolio for over a decade. Chris had somehow convinced Sheldon that he needed to review my accounts to prepare for the inevitable. The life insurance policy is worth $400,000, Chris was saying, his voice businesslike and efficient. The house is appraised at $650,000, and it's completely paid off. The rental properties should bring in another $800,000, maybe more depending on the market. What about the investment accounts? I listened in horror as Sheldon detailed my financial life to my son. The retirement accounts I had built through decades of careful saving. The stock portfolio that had grown through consistent contributions and smart reinvestment of dividends. The bonds and CDs that provided steady income for my comfortable retirement. Chris was cataloging every asset like he was already its owner. Total liquid assets are approximately $1.2 million, Sheldon concluded. Plus the real estate and life insurance. You're looking at an estate worth around $2.6 million. Of course, there will be taxes and probate costs, but it's still a substantial inheritance. After Chris hung up, he made another call, this one to Carla. It's even better than we thought, he said, his voice filled with excitement he didn't bother to hide. Between everything, we're looking at close to $3 million, once it's all liquidated. We can pay off the house, get you that car you wanted, and still have enough left over to start that consulting business I've been talking about. What about Eloise and Liam? Carla asked. Won't they expect their share? Chris laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. Mom's will leaves everything split 3 ways, but here's the beautiful part. Eloise makes 6 figures in California, and has never needed family money. Liam is too proud to ask for help after that restaurant disaster. I'm betting I can convince them to let me handle the estate settlement, maybe give them some sentimental items, and keep the bulk of the assets in exchange for managing everything. And if they don't agree, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Chris said. But right now, they're both so wrapped up in their own lives that they're leaving all the decisions to me. By the time they realize what the estate is actually worth, I'll already have control of everything. The conversation that followed revealed the true depth of Chris's planning. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in grief and desperation. He had been researching my financial situation for months, possibly years, waiting for an opportunity like this. He knew exactly what assets I owned, where they were held, and how to access them once I was gone. More disturbing still, I began to understand that Chris had been subtly encouraging my social isolation for the past several years. Every time I mentioned joining a new club or activity, he would find reasons why it wasn't a good idea. Too expensive, too far to drive, too many strangers who might take advantage of an elderly woman living alone. He had systematically discouraged me from forming new friendships or maintaining old ones, ensuring that when something happened to me, he would be the primary source of information about my condition and wishes. The few friends I had left rarely visited, because Chris had told them I was becoming antisocial and preferred to be left alone. My neighbors knew I was in the hospital, because Mrs. Haven had found me, but Chris had told them the family preferred privacy during this difficult time. Even my longtime physician, Dr. Haven, was getting his updates about my condition secondhand through Chris, rather than through direct consultation. On the 7th day, I overheard the conversation that revealed just how far Chris was willing to go to ensure his payday arrived on schedule. He was talking to Dr. Nelson about my lack of improvement, expressing concern that prolonging my care was causing unnecessary suffering. "Doctor, I've been doing some research about conditions like MOMS," Chris said, his voice heavy with fake emotion. "Is there any real possibility that she could recover enough to have any quality of life? Because if this is all she'll ever be, if she's trapped in there unable to communicate or care for herself, then keeping her alive seems cruel." Dr. Nelson, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, tried to maintain hope. "These cases are unpredictable, Mr. Caldwell. Sometimes patients who seem completely unresponsive can make remarkable recoveries. I'd hate to give up too soon. But you said yourself that the brain damage is extensive," Chris pressed. "Even if she woke up, wouldn't she likely be severely disabled? Mom always said she never wanted to be a burden on anyone, never wanted to live if she couldn't take care of herself." That was a complete lie. I had never expressed any such sentiment to Chris, or anyone else. The breaking point came on day 10, when I heard Chris making the call that would have sealed my fate. He wasn't talking to Dr. Nelson this time, but to someone at a crematorium, pricing out services with the casual tone of someone shopping for groceries. "I need to arrange cremation for my mother," he said. "She's currently in the ICU, but the doctors expect she'll pass within the next few days. I want to have everything ready, so we can move quickly once it happens. She always said she wanted a simple service, nothing elaborate." Another lie. I had never discussed funeral preferences with Chris, mainly because the subject had never come up, and partly because I had assumed I had many more years to worry about such things. "What's your most basic package?" Chris continued. "She won't be having a viewing, just immediate cremation, and a small memorial service afterward. Maybe 40 or 50 people at most." As Chris discussed pricing and scheduling, I realized he was planning to have me cremated as quickly as possible, probably to prevent anyone from asking questions about my condition or requesting additional medical opinions. Once I was reduced to ashes, there would be no possibility of an autopsy or second opinion about the cause of death. But something remarkable was happening to my body during these horrible conversations. The more angry and desperate I became, the more control I seemed to be gaining over my physical responses. At first it was just tiny movements. A finger twitch that no one noticed. A slight change in my breathing pattern when Chris was in the room. The ability to flutter my eyelids for brief moments, though never when anyone was looking directly at my face. Dr. Nelson had mentioned during one of his examinations that some stroke patients experienced periods of improved responsiveness before suffering additional complications. If the medical staff noticed these small signs of recovery, they might attribute them to random neurological activity rather than genuine consciousness returning. I began testing my abilities carefully, trying to move when I was alone, or when the only person in the room was a nurse who wasn't paying close attention to my face. Each day brought slightly more control, slightly more awareness of my surroundings. I could hear conversations more clearly, distinguish between different voices, and even begin to understand the layout of my room, based on the sounds of footsteps and equipment. On day 12, a miracle occurred that Chris couldn't have anticipated. Mrs. Haven came to visit me, bringing with her someone I hadn't expected to see. My former colleague from the hospital, Nurse Edna Nelson, who happened to be Dr. Nelson's wife. Edna had worked with me for 15 years before we both retired, and she knew me better than almost anyone outside my family. "Helen looks different than I expected," Edna said to Mrs. Haven as they stood beside my bed. When Chris called to tell me about her condition, he made it sound like she was completely unresponsive. But her color is good, her breathing seems strong, and there's something about her facial expression that doesn't look like someone who's brain dead. Mrs. Haven agreed. "I've been visiting every day since I found her, and I swear sometimes it looks like she's trying to open her eyes. The nurses say it's just reflexes, but I know Helen. She's a fighter. She wouldn't give up this easily. Edna moved closer to my bed and began speaking directly to me, using the tone she had always used when we worked together on difficult cases. Helen, if you can hear me, I want you to know that Arthur is still checking on you. He asked me to tell you that he's reviewed your medical records, and he has some concerns about the rush to withdraw life support. Arthur Nelson, Dr. Nelson was Edna's husband, and she was giving me information about my own case that Chris didn't know she had access to. The neurologist Arthur consulted with in Seattle thinks you might be experiencing locked-in syndrome rather than brain death, Edna continued. It's a condition where patients are conscious but unable to move or speak. Arthur wants to run additional tests before any decisions are made about ending treatment. I tried with every ounce of strength I possessed to show them I could hear. I focused all my energy on opening my eyes, moving my hand, making any sign that would prove I was still fighting for my life. For a moment, nothing happened. Then incredibly, I felt my right index finger move slightly against the bedsheet. Edna saw it. "Did you see that?" she asked Mrs. Haven excitedly. "Helen, if that was intentional, try to do it again." I concentrated harder than I ever had in my life, and managed to twitch my finger twice more. It wasn't much, but it was enough to convince Edna that I was more aware than anyone realized. "I'm going to talk to Arthur immediately," she told Mrs. Haven. "This changes everything. Chris needs to know that his mother might be recovering, and those life support decisions need to be postponed until we can do more comprehensive testing." What happened next was the most terrifying 24 hours of my entire life. Edna went straight to her husband with the news that I had shown signs of responsiveness, and Dr. Nelson immediately ordered a new series of neurological tests. But before those tests could be completed, Chris made his move. I don't know if he suspected that someone was questioning his version of events, or if he was simply growing impatient with the timeline, but on day 13 he arrived at the hospital with a lawyer and a stack of legal documents. I heard him in the hallway outside my room, speaking in urgent whispers with someone who introduced himself as attorney Liam Salvatore. "The family has made the difficult decision to withdraw life support," Chris was telling the lawyer. "We've consulted with multiple doctors, and they all agree that my mother has no chance of meaningful recovery. Continuing treatment at this point is just prolonging her suffering and depleting her estate unnecessarily." "Do you have the medical power of attorney documentation?" the lawyer asked. "Right here," Chris replied. "Everything is properly notarized and witnessed. As her oldest child and the only family member who lives locally, I have full authority to make medical decisions on her behalf." What Chris didn't know was that Dr. Nelson had already flagged my case for additional review based on Edna's observations. When Chris arrived with his lawyer demanding immediate withdrawal of life support, he walked into a situation that was no longer under his control. "Mr. Caldwell, I understand your family's position," Dr. Nelson said when he was called to meet with them. "However, we've had some developments in your mother's case that require further evaluation before we can proceed with ending treatment." I could hear the tension in Chris's voice when he responded. "What kind of developments? You told me her condition was stable but hopeless." "We've observed some neurological responses that suggest your mother may be experiencing locked-in syndrome rather than brain death," Dr. Nelson explained. "This is a rare condition where patients are conscious and aware but unable to move or communicate normally. We need to run additional tests to determine her actual level of consciousness before making any irreversible decisions." The silence that followed was deafening. Chris was calculating, trying to figure out how this development would affect his plans. The lawyer was probably wondering if he had walked into a more complicated situation than he had been hired to handle. Finally, Chris spoke, and the cold calculation in his voice made my blood run cold. "Doctor, with respect, my family has been through enough. We've watched my mother suffer for nearly 2 weeks. Even if she is conscious, what kind of life would that be for her? Trapped in a body that doesn't work, unable to communicate, completely dependent on others for everything. My mother was an independent woman who valued her dignity above all else. She would never want to exist in that condition. Mr. Caldwell, if your mother is conscious, then she should have a say in decisions about her own care," Dr. Nelson replied firmly. "We have methods of communicating with locked-in patients. She could indicate her own wishes about treatment." "And what if she's not conscious?" Chris pressed. "What if these responses you're seeing are just random neurological activity? How long are you going to keep her on machines based on wishful thinking?" The lawyer interjected at this point. "Doctor, my client has legal authority to make these decisions. While I appreciate your medical concerns, the family has the right to refuse continued treatment if they believe it's not in the patient's best interests." Dr. Nelson was quiet for a long moment. I could almost feel him weighing his medical judgment against the legal and emotional pressure Chris was applying. Finally he spoke, and his words gave me hope. "I'm going to request a consultation with our ethics committee," he said. "Given the potential for consciousness and the irreversible nature of withdrawing life support, I think we need additional perspectives on this case before proceeding." Chris's voice turned sharp with barely contained anger. "How long will that take?" "The committee meets twice a week. We can have a review by Thursday." "Thursday," Chris exploded. "Doctor, that's 4 more days of keeping my mother on machines when she may be suffering. 4 more days of false hope for our family. 4 more days of depleting her estate to pay for medical care that may be completely futile." It was that last comment about depleting the estate that sealed Chris's fate in my mind. In that moment I understood with crystal clarity that his concern had never been about my suffering or dignity. It was about money, pure and simple. He wanted me dead before the medical bills could reduce his inheritance. That night, alone in my hospital room with only the sound of machines keeping me alive, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to fight back with every ounce of strength I had left. The ethics committee meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, which gave me 3 days to prove I was conscious enough to make my own decisions. But I had another problem. Even if I could demonstrate awareness, Chris still had legal power of attorney and could potentially override my wishes by claiming I wasn't competent to make rational decisions about my care. I needed help, and the only person in a position to provide it was Edna Nelson. During her next visit, I focused every ounce of energy I possessed on communicating with her. When she leaned close to check on me, I managed to move my eyes slightly toward her face and hold her gaze for several seconds. "Helen, I know you're in there," she whispered. "Arthur is fighting for you, but we need to prove you're conscious and competent. Can you blink once for yes and twice for no?" I concentrated harder than I ever had in my life, and managed one deliberate blink. "Good," Edna said, tears forming in her eyes. "Now do you understand that Chris wants to withdraw your life support?" One blink. "Yes." "Do you want us to prevent that from happening?" One blink. "Yes." "Do you know that Chris has been planning to inherit your estate?" One blink. "Yes." Edna was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I was telling her. Then she asked the question that would change everything. "Helen, do you believe Chris wants you to die for financial reasons rather than medical ones?" I summoned every bit of strength I had and managed the clearest, most deliberate blink I had achieved since awakening. "Yes." "Oh my God," Edna breathed. "Helen, if what you're suggesting is true, then Chris is essentially committing murder. We need to document everything you've told me and get you legal protection immediately. Over the next 2 days, Edna worked tirelessly to build a case for my competency and expose Chris's true motivations. She brought in a specialist in locked-in syndrome, who confirmed that my responses were consistent with conscious awareness rather than random neurological activity. She documented our communication sessions on video, showing clearly that I could answer questions appropriately and consistently. Most importantly, she helped me contact an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. Attorney Arthur Haven arrived at the hospital on Wednesday evening, just hours before the ethics committee was scheduled to meet. Through painstaking yes and no questions, I was able to communicate the essential facts of what I had overheard Chris planning. Mrs. Caldwell, if I understand correctly, you believe your son has been planning your death in order to inherit your estate? Attorney Haven asked. One blink. Yes. And you heard him discuss your financial assets with your investment advisor? One blink. Yes. Did you ever tell Chris that you wanted to be cremated immediately after death? 2 blinks. No. Did you ever express wishes to him about withdrawing life support if you were in this condition? 2 blinks. No. Attorney Haven spent an hour documenting my responses, building a legal record that would protect me from Chris's attempts to end my life. He also explained that he would be filing emergency motions to suspend Chris's power of attorney and have a court-appointed guardian assigned to represent my interests. Mrs. Caldwell, I want you to understand that what we're alleging here is very serious, he said. We're essentially accusing your son of attempted murder for financial gain. Once we file these papers, there will be no going back. Your family relationships will be permanently destroyed. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? I thought about the son I had raised, the boy who had charmed everyone with his smile, the young man I had supported through countless failures and mistakes. I thought about the lonely years ahead if I survived this ordeal, knowing that my own child had tried to kill me for money. Then I thought about Chris's voice as he planned my cremation, the excitement in his tone when he discussed my assets with Carla, the calculated way he had isolated me from friends and family to make his plan easier to execute. One blink. Yes. The ethics committee meeting the next morning was unlike anything the hospital had ever experienced. Instead of a routine review of end-of-life care decisions, it became an emergency hearing about suspected elder abuse and attempted murder. Dr. Nelson presented the medical evidence showing that I was conscious and capable of communication. Edna testified about her observations of my responsiveness and our documented conversations. Attorney Haven presented the legal evidence of Chris's financial motivations and the inconsistencies in his claims about my wishes. Chris arrived expecting a formality that would rubber stamp his decision to withdraw my life support. Instead, he walked into a room full of medical professionals and legal experts who were questioning every aspect of his story. Mr. Caldwell, can you explain why you contacted a crematorium before your mother had actually died? Dr. Nelson asked. I was just being prepared, Chris stammered. I wanted to have arrangements in place so the family wouldn't have to deal with those details during our grief. And can you explain why you told the crematorium that your mother had requested immediate cremation when she has now indicated that she never expressed such wishes? Chris's face went pale. She's not competent to make rational decisions. The trauma has obviously affected her memory and judgment. That's when Attorney Haven dropped the bombshell that would expose Chris's entire scheme. Mr. Caldwell, we have recorded evidence of your mother communicating coherently about events that occurred while she was supposedly unconscious. Attorney Haven announced, producing a tablet with video files. She has provided detailed responses about conversations she overheard, including your discussions about her financial assets and your plans for her estate. The room fell silent as the attorney played the first video. It showed me clearly responding to Edna's questions about Chris's phone calls, blinking once for yes when asked if I had heard him discussing my life insurance policy, and twice for no when asked if I had ever given him permission to access my financial information. Chris's lawyer immediately objected. These responses could be coincidental. Brain-injured patients often have involuntary reactions that can be misinterpreted as communication. Then perhaps Mr. Caldwell can explain this, Attorney Haven said, playing a second video where I accurately answered specific questions about the content of Chris's conversations, including the exact dollar amounts he had discussed with my financial advisor. The ethics committee members exchanged glances as the implications became clear. There was no way I could have known those specific financial details unless I had actually been conscious and listening during those conversations. Dr. Nelson leaned forward in his chair. Mr. Caldwell, did you discuss your mother's assets with her financial advisor while she was unconscious? Chris shifted uncomfortably. I needed to understand her financial situation to make informed decisions about her care. Long-term medical treatment is expensive, and I had to consider whether depleting her estate for hopeless care was what she would have wanted. But, according to these recordings, your mother never expressed wishes about withdrawing life support in hopeless medical situations, Attorney Haven interjected. In fact, she has specifically indicated that she wants all possible medical treatment continued. She's not thinking clearly, Chris protested, his voice rising with desperation. The brain damage has obviously affected her judgment. She doesn't understand her condition or the implications of prolonged care. That's when Dr. Nelson delivered the statement that would destroy Chris's entire plan. Mr. Caldwell, we've completed additional neurological testing over the past 48 hours. Your mother's brain function is not only intact, but it's improving rapidly. The stroke damage was less severe than initially thought, and with proper rehabilitation she has an excellent chance of making a nearly complete recovery. The color drained from Chris's face completely. That's impossible. You said she was brain dead. You said there was no hope. I said her condition appeared hopeless based on initial assessments, Dr. Nelson corrected. But medicine is not an exact science, and patients sometimes surprise us with their resilience. Your mother is living proof that we should never give up too quickly. Chris's lawyer was frantically taking notes, probably realizing that his client had walked into a situation that could result in criminal charges. Chris himself looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. This is ridiculous, Chris said, his voice cracking with panic. My mother is 73 years old. Even if she recovers, what kind of life will she have? She'll need constant care, physical therapy, probably years of rehabilitation. The costs will be astronomical. Costs that would come out of her estate, Attorney Haven observed pointedly. Estate that you've already been planning to inherit. The room erupted as Chris realized his true motivations had been exposed to everyone present. You don't understand, Chris said, his composure completely shattered now. I've been taking care of her for years. Do you have any idea what it's like watching your mother slowly decline, knowing that everything she worked for is going to be eaten up by medical bills and nursing home costs? I was trying to preserve her dignity and her legacy. By having her cremated while she was still alive, Dr. Nelson asked coldly. The ethics committee chairman, Dr. Eloise Salvatore, stood up with a grim expression. Caldwell, based on the evidence presented here today, we are immediately suspending your medical power of attorney. The hospital will be appointing a court-designated guardian to represent your mother's interests going forward. Chris jumped to his feet. You can't do that. I'm her son. I'm the only one who knows what she would want. What she wants is to live. Attorney Haven replied simply. She's made that abundantly clear through her own communication. And frankly, Mr. Caldwell, your financial motivations have been so thoroughly documented that your judgment about her care is now permanently suspect. That's when Chris made the mistake that would seal his fate. In his desperation and panic, he revealed just how much planning had gone into his scheme. "Fine," he shouted. "You want to know the truth? Yes, I was planning for her death. Do you know what it's like being the responsible child while your siblings live their perfect lives in other states? I'm the one who checks on her. I'm the one who handles her problems. I'm the one who'll be stuck dealing with her decline while Eloise and Liam send birthday cards from California and Seattle." The room was completely silent as Chris continued his meltdown. "She has $2.5 million sitting in accounts doing nothing while I'm struggling to pay my mortgage. While Carla and I have put our lives on hold waiting for her to need us. And now you're telling me she's going to recover so she can live another 10 years spending everything on medical care and assisted living." Dr. Salvatore looked disgusted. "Mr. Caldwell, you are describing your mother's recovery as an inconvenience to your inheritance plans. Do you understand how that sounds?" Chris's lawyer was tugging at his sleeve, trying to get him to stop talking, but the damage was already done. In his panic, Chris had confessed to everything we suspected and more. "I need to make some phone calls," Attorney Haven said quietly. "Dr. Salvatore, I'll be contacting the district attorney's office about potential elder abuse and attempted murder charges. This situation goes far beyond a family disagreement about medical care." As the committee members filed out of the room, Chris stood frozen in place, finally understanding that his perfect plan had not only failed but had exposed him to criminal prosecution. His lawyer was already explaining in urgent whispers about plea bargains and damage control. But I wasn't done with Chris yet. Thanks to Dr. Nelson's treatment and the intensive therapy that began immediately after the ethics committee meeting, my recovery progressed faster than anyone had expected. Within a week, I could speak in whispers. Within 2 weeks, I could sit up with assistants. And within 3 weeks, I was strong enough to do something Chris never saw coming. I planned to attend his inheritance party. The inheritance party was Carla's idea, according to the phone calls I overheard during my recovery. Despite the ethics committee's findings and the pending criminal investigation, Chris had convinced himself that he could still salvage his plan. He told Carla that the hospital was just being overly cautious, that I was still essentially brain damaged, and that it was only a matter of time before he regained control of my medical decisions. What Chris didn't know was that Attorney Haven had already filed paperwork transferring all my assets into a protected trust, making it impossible for anyone to access them without court approval. He also didn't know that Eloise and Liam were finally flying in to see me, after learning the truth about my condition from Dr. Nelson rather than Chris's filtered version. But most importantly, Chris didn't know that I had been secretly working with Mrs. Haven and Edna to gather evidence of all his financial preparations. We had copies of his calls to the crematorium, records of his meetings with my financial advisor, and documentation of every asset he had researched while planning my death. The party was held at my house, the house Chris had already mentally claimed as his own. He had invited about 30 people, mostly neighbors and acquaintances who had known me casually. The invitation which Mrs. Haven showed me described it as a celebration of Helen's life and the legacy she left behind. I arrived in a taxi at exactly 7 o'clock, just as the party was getting into full swing. Through the living room windows, I could see Chris holding court near the fireplace, probably telling stories about what a wonderful mother I had been, and how difficult it was to lose me so suddenly. Carla was in the kitchen, serving drinks and accepting condolences from guests who had no idea they were attending a party thrown by my would-be murderer in the house he was already planning to sell. I walked up to the front door of my own home and rang the doorbell. Mrs. Haven answered, and her scream of shock was so loud it could probably be heard 3 blocks away. "Helen! Oh my God, Helen! The entire party fell silent. Through the doorway, I could see Chris's face go white as he realized his worst nightmare had just walked up to his celebration party. "Hello, everyone," I said, stepping into my living room where 30 people were staring at me like I was an actual ghost. "I hope you don't mind me crashing my own funeral reception." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Several guests were reaching for their phones, probably wondering if they should call 911 or just start recording what was obviously about to become the most dramatic confrontation any of them had ever witnessed. Chris stood frozen by the fireplace, holding a glass of wine, my wine, from my collection, while his brain tried to process how his supposedly dead mother was standing in his inherited living room, very much alive, and looking absolutely furious. "Chris," I said pleasantly, "we need to talk." That's when Carla fainted. Several guests started whispering prayers, and Chris dropped his wine glass, which shattered on the hardwood floor he'd already been planning to refinish. The inheritance party had just become a resurrection confrontation, and I was about to serve justice colder than any revenge Chris could have imagined. That confrontation at my own inheritance party was 2 years ago, and it remains the most satisfying moment of my 75 years on this earth. The look on Chris's face when he realized his dead mother was very much alive and absolutely furious will stay with me forever. The criminal charges stuck. Chris pled guilty to elder abuse and attempted fraud, receiving 2 years in prison and 5 years probation. Carla divorced him before the trial ended, claiming she had been manipulated by his lies about my condition. I don't believe her, but I don't care enough to pursue it. Eloise and Liam both apologized profusely for not coming to see me in the hospital, for trusting Chris's version of events without question. We've rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully, with honest conversations about the family dynamics that allowed this betrayal to happen. They visit regularly now, not out of obligation but because we've finally learned to genuinely enjoy each other's company. My recovery was remarkable, according to Dr. Nelson. Within 6 months, I had regained full mobility and most of my cognitive function. The experience taught me that I'm far stronger than I ever imagined, and that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing. I've sold the house where Chris planned his inheritance party and moved to a smaller place near Mrs. Haven and Edna. I volunteer at a legal aid clinic, helping other elderly people recognize and protect themselves from financial abuse by family members. The money Chris was so eager to inherit, I'm spending it on travel, experiences, and donations to causes I believe in. Every dollar I spend is a dollar he'll never get, and I've never felt more free. To anyone facing family betrayal or financial manipulation, remember this: blood relationships don't give people the right to abuse you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is cut toxic people out of your life completely, even if they share your DNA. I learned that being declared dead was the best thing that ever happened to me. It showed me who I really was, and more importantly, who I wanted to become. And I'm very much alive.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.